I thank you all for being here today. We had this scheduled once before, but a snowstorm, got in the way of it, back in February or March or something like that, and it gave me a lot more time to think about all of this too. That after meeting with Roger in his studio and having an extra few months to think about all of this, it really kind of solidified in my mind that. The human society in which we dwell is essentially, it is a whole compilation of constructs that we have created of infinite proportions, that they're visual and social and political, economic, religious, mythic, all of these things that we construct that govern the way that we assume and approach and think about things that are around us. And so inundated are we by all of these constructs that we tend to look at them really without seeing them for what they in fact are, because they just become assumptions of how our world is. But as the author Anais Nin put it, she said, we see things not as they are, but as we are. I think we all can agree with that. We see things through the lenses of our experience. And so, in other words, the construct is not solely the thing or the image itself, but the manner in which we see it, the worldview or the cultural bias through which we see it. Roger Shimomura's paintings and prints are an exploration of what has been called the cultural self, constructed of both internal and external identities, the struggle of communities of identification that are multiple, discontinuous, and also imaginary. Some of these are constantly shifting and moving, while others that are cultural and ethnic and racial are, even in the 21st century here, frighteningly static in the shape of stereotype and profiling and discrimination. Throughout his remarkable career, Roger Shimomura, his art has served as a powerful channel to expose these constructs, particularly those that are confronting Asian Americans. His images challenge the viewer to deconstruct them, to deconstruct ourselves, hopefully to reconstruct all of these things in ways that we can truly see the way that we have been seeing the world around us. Roger Shimomura served as professor of art for 35 years, from 1969 through 2004 at the University of Kansas. Both regionally and nationally, he has received numerous accolades, awards, and honors. His work has been exhibited in over 85 different galleries in this country and is sought after by collectors. His papers have been deposited at the Smithsonian Institution's Archives of American Art. And I'm proud to say as well that at Johnson County Community College that we have 7 of his works here that are on display in this museum and on the campus at large here. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our special guest this afternoon, Professor Roger Shimomura.
Thank you very much. Somebody asked me how many times I've spoken here, and I think this is the 3rd time. Not that that's of any interest to anybody, but last night I went through this talk very quickly, and I took out 28 slides because I was told that I was to keep this down under 45 minutes, which I have never done in my life, and not even close to it. So this is kind of a guesstimate. So if you hear me talking a little too fast, there's a reason for that, because we do want to leave a little time for you to ask questions from Tim and I, right over here. The reason I have 3 chapters underneath the title of this talk was I gave this talk major surgery about a year ago, just because, when you've been doing this for 45 years and 800 paintings or so and about 150 prints and I think 75 performance pieces, it's hard to talk about that in time period of 1 hour. And so I decided what I would do is completely revamp the talk and focus on just 3 themes that have recurred in my work over the years. The first one having to do with the World War II concentration camps that Japanese Americans were placed in. Secondly, the stereotypes that towards Asian American people, Asian and Asian American people, that continue to reappear, and I will show you some evidence of that. And then thirdly, issues of ethnic identity. These are the these are the kinds of issues that got me started doing the kinds of work that I'm doing. Those sort of nagging kind of slip-ups, things that people say that maybe no harm intended, trying to make a joke, but ends up being pretty cutting if you're the person that's at the other end of that. So that's what I'm referring to when I use the term 3 chapters, those 3 areas. But I do need to give you a little background about how I got started in all this. First of all, I came to Kansas in 1969. If I get the lights at this point. Well, let me just say something about this sort of introductory slide that's up there. That's a photograph I found in my parents' album. That's me on the far right and 2 of my buddies there. And when we got out of the camps and back to our homes and started piecing our lives back together again, we used to play Kill the Japs. And I remember the arguments that we would have because we had to take turns being the Japs, because the Japs always got killed and the good guys would win. So that's, an example, I think, of how disassociated we as Japanese Americans felt about or towards the Japanese people or a Japanese enemy at that time. I came to Lawrence in 1969, right out of graduate school from the East Coast. And I was married at the time, and my wife and I would attend auctions to buy household items. I mean, we came right out of graduate school, came with a very small truckload of stuff, but really needed a lot of the things to operate a household. And so I started going to all of the auctions in Lawrence, in the neighborhood and neighboring areas, and realized that there was a real culture of not only auctions, estate auctions, but a culture of collecting. And that's really what started getting me involved in some serious collecting. I've been a collector all my life, from the time that I was a child, and collecting bubblegum cards and bottle caps and things of that sort, all the way through junior high and high school and college. I could measure those times according to what I was collecting. And having those things around me began to affect some of the imagery in my work. And I want to sort of share some of those with you as they appear. But today, if you went to our house in Lawrence, it's, some say, like a little mini museum. It's not so mini. The house is over 5,000 square feet. But there are these pockets of collections, and a lot of these are salt and pepper shakers. Those are salesman samples in the upper right. Fiesta ware, Harlequin, things like that in the lower left, things that I've stopped collecting for 25 years ago. More salt and pepper shakers and salesman samples. This mannequin is in the studio bathroom, and it's right next to the toilet. It's in the bathroom. And from what I understand, it's quite intimidating to people that use the bathroom. We're used to it, but you sit down on the toilet and you have this person sitting right next to you. A little bothersome. But on her dress is my Mao pin collection. And in the upper right and lower right are prizes from the 1930s and 40s carnivals. Popping balloons with darts, and some of you people closer to my age will remember those kinds of carnivals, throwing ping pong balls and fish bowls and things like that. But when I got to Syracuse, or got to Lawrence from Syracuse, I started picking up these antique tin wind-up toys and just fell in love with them. And I thought they were the most, and still do think they're the most beautiful, some of the most beautiful objects in the world. And what you're seeing here represents maybe 10% of the collection. And the lower left shows you how many variations of just one theme that they would make, just to appeal to collectors, because collectors had to have them all. On the lower right became the focus of my collection, the Walt Disney and particularly Mickey Mouse. Those bisque figures at that time in the early 70s were costing maybe $2 to $3 a piece. And when this collection was ultimately auctioned off years later, those Mickey Mouses were bringing $250 a piece. And some of the toys went for as high as $5,000. Toys that I got for 50 cents in garage sales. And so this is a painting I did at that time, so you could see the effect. I was at this time working with a lot of comic imagery, so it's not as though it was all because of the collections, but sort of hand in hand, both things happen. This was this is a 5 by 5 foot acrylic painting, which is about that size that you're seeing there. It's called, well, the title's right there. It was kind of a fantasy realized of if you shaved off the black on Mickey's head, what might be there. Coke Freak was inspired by the 5-cent Coke machine that we had in the kitchen, and eventually my wife said, that's got to go. We just don't have enough space. So the only place to put it was out in the front porch. So it became kind of a signature item out there where, we just tell people we live where the 5-cent Coke machine is. And I don't know what possessed me to paint Jesus. I seldom say Jesus. I say this man or this person walking in front. It's just that I knew I wanted someone walking by, and I thought that would really kind of strengthen the imagery, if it was someone that everyone recognized. And stopped right under that Coca-Cola sign as though it were a halo right above his head. And the title, Coke Freak, because at the time there were a lot of people that, freaks that looked like that. But it was a conversation at one of these auctions that changed everything for me, and it happened with a conversation I had with a farmer who was standing next to me at an auction, and I was there with a colleague of mine, Mike Ott, and there was a break in the auction, and this farmer who kept moving closer and closer to me, it was clear that he was going to say something, and he said, during a break, he said, excuse me, I was overhearing you speak the language, and I came to wondering how you came to speaking it so well. And he said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Seattle. And this was the umpteenth time I had been asked that question since I had been in Lawrence. And then he said, that's not what I mean. He says, where are your parents from? And I said, well, my father was also born in Seattle, and my mother was born in Idaho. and then he looked at me and he said, are you Indian? And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I teach at KU. I teach painting. And then he broke out in this sort of GI Japanese and said, what, konnichiwa? He said, the little lady and I were there back in the 50s, and he said, we collected pictures of them Gishi girls wearing kimonos. And he said, you do pictures like that? And I just kind of shrugged my shoulder, and I don't even remember the answer I gave him, but I remember I just walked away from him. And I thought that conversation had pretty much summarized probably a half a dozen conversations I had had with other people since being in Lawrence. There just weren't many people around that looked like me, other than the native population at Haskell. And so I decided for the first time, I remember that auction was on a Friday afternoon, and I went to my studio, and I thought for the first time I would respond by way of my art. And so I went to the Union, and I got what was called the Coloring Book of Japan, and it was filled with drawings of ukiyo-e woodblock prints. And I took it to my studio and projected some of these images up on my canvas. And I did a painting and called it Oriental Masterpiece. And not thinking that I would ever do another painting like this, I included this in an exhibition I had in Seattle just shortly after that. And what was fascinating was that this is a painting that everybody talked to me about at my show. And the other paintings in that show were like the Big Bad Wolf painting and other comic characters. And the comment that people would make is, you know, it's really good to see you do paintings like that. And I said, why? And they said, because you look like that. And that was a real eye-opening comment to hear, because to me, it looked very foreign, because I never had things like that around me when I was growing up. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the incarceration experience that my parents, as my whole family, including myself, experienced, looking too Japanese. And so our house literally was purged of things that were Japanese. You know, so when people said, you look like that, it was a real shock to me. And I came back from my opening in Seattle and decided that I would do some more paintings, and ended up doing over 100 of these paintings, numbering them Oriental Masterpiece number 75, 95, whatever. Okay, chapter 1, the first area of research I moved into were the camps. For those of you that don't know, there were 10 of these located west of the Mississippi. The one that our family was in was called Minidoka, which was out in the lava beds in southern Idaho. Total population of these camps, about 121,000. And the 121,000 represented about 95% of all the Japanese American people that were living in America. They all happened to be living right along that strip on the West Coast. The government decided that we were not to be trusted, and therefore, as President Roosevelt, in his own words, said, we must put them in concentration camps. That's a term he used. We were in there from a period of up to 4 years. Our family was in for 2 years, 2 full years in Minidoka. You could see what they looked like, the top two. Now, they were in such a rush to get us into these camps that obviously, they weren't built yet, but they were in a panic to get us out of our houses and out of the neighborhoods, because they thought we were spies. And so they had to put us someplace. So where they put us was in the state fairgrounds in Puyallup, Washington. And there, in the bottom picture, we lived in horse stalls and other makeshift buildings that were put up underneath the rodeo grandstands. And we lived there for 3 months as Minidoka was being built. And so did other Japanese Americans in other parts of the West Coast. They were all sent to, they called them assembly centers, for about 3 months, and then sent to the camps. So after a period of about 3 months, they took us out of the assembly centers and put us in trains, and and pulled down all the shades so we couldn't see where we were going, and the train just sort of took off into the, as my grandmother said, the hinterlands. And 2 days later, they allowed us to come out of the trains, and we faced our future homes. This is my mother, my father, and myself in Minidoka. And this is my grandmother, who has played a key role in not only our lives, but my artwork. My grandmother was the immigrant. She was the pioneer. She was a photo bride. She first went to nursing school in Japan, graduated in 1902, and then in 1904 was sent to the Japan-Russian War. And then following that, she was sent, I thought I had a picture of that, but Grandma was set up to be a photo bride with my grandfather, who was already in this country. My grandfather came in 1906 and intended to become a dentist, but that dream was never realized. During the time that from 1906 to 1912, when my grandmother came, my grandfather had jobs working in canneries as a janitor, as a cook. And so in 1912, a photo arrangement was set up between my grandmother and grandfather, and both families approved. And so my grandmother got on a ship with 60 other photo brides. They were all going to come to America to meet their husbands, only on the basis of a photograph that they held of him. And conversely, the men were in America with photographs of the future wife that was coming over on a ship. This is my grandmother in the lower right-hand corner, and 3 of the other 60 photo brides, the captain of the ship. My grandmother began to keep a diary at that point, and it's a fascinating story, after translated, of course, of the 3-week trip over on a ship, and then for the next 56 years of her life, she maintained this diary. So in 1976, I decided to do a series of paintings, and this was the first time that I had ever worked with any kind of history and stories, that were related to my family. First time I worked with that in my paintings, and I did this series of 6 paintings called the Minidoka series. And this one, this is 5 by 6 feet, and it's an homage to my grandmother, who kept a diary all during that time, and my mother and I in the upper right-hand corner of the painting. And if you look out that opening, you could see, it's hard to see, but there's a barbed wire fence and a guard tower out there. And I decided to do this series, keeping it looking as though they were woodblock prints. In other words, the old style 16th, 17th century Japanese costuming. And the reason for that was because at that time, in the late 70s, no one was doing this kind of work. And for the few of us that were, it was being called inappropriate, and not, that art was not a place that you should discuss these kinds of things. And so what I did was I created these paintings that looked a lot more attractive than they really were about. I called it like spraying perfume over body odor. And I thought, I'll show you the next painting, which is called The Exodus, the move to the camps. I thought if people bought these for their decorative sense, then they deserve to one day find out that that's not what the work was really about. I mean, you know, that moment that they would realize that was sort of my moment. And then in 1980, actually it was about 79, I brought back my grandmother's diaries from Lawrence, or to Lawrence, and I started having them slowly translated, and I found a graduate student that was quite capable of translating the diaries, and I decided as I was reading these translations, and I had the camp years translated first, I decided that if it seemed appropriate, I would do a series of paintings based upon those translations, and continuing to keep them still in this woodblock style. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this is the Pearl Harbor Day entry. And my grandmother said, "Today, when I came back from church, I heard the dreamlike news that Japanese airplanes had bombed Hawaii. I was scared beyond belief. It was said that at 6 a.m. Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Our future has become gloomy. I pray that God will stay with us." I was collecting Art Deco radios, and so it was an opportune time, again, you know, referring back to the collecting influencing the work. It worked out for me that there were five of these paintings sold in the course of this exhibition traveling around the country, and so it gave me an opportunity to paint 5 different radios. At the same time, I started becoming interested in experimental theater, and I wrote my first piece called the 7 Kabuki Plays Project, and decided that each act would go through one of the compositions of the diary paintings that I had done. So this was the Pearl Harbor Day entry. And so at this moment, Grandma is listening to President Roosevelt give the Days of Infamy speech that's so historically important now. And at that moment, Superman, that represents America, is raised in the background 35 feet in the air. And the figures in black you can see with the spotlights are called kurogo in Kabuki theater. And they are meant to be unseen, but obviously are very visible most of the time. And they come bringing in props on the stage, and they remove props. And they even come in and change costumes on the actors, and it really becomes part of the whole performance. And so I appropriated a lot of that for these performances. Eventually, with 7 acts, there were 7 paintings that it covered, and this was performed in stages. Act 1 was at KU. Act 1, 2, and 3 was at Washburn. 1 through 5 was performed at Emporia, and 1 through 7 was performed at Winfield. And it took a period of 2 years for that to come together. In 1997, I returned back to that diary format, and I did this series called An American Diary. Each of these paintings was accompanied by one of my grandmother's diary entries. In this one, it was the first day that she arrived at camp, and the bus pulled up, and she looked at it and said, "I can't believe we're going to be expected to live here." And these were very small paintings. They're only 10 by 14 inches, and they were meant to be sort of like snapshots. And there were 35 of them that constituted this series. And underneath each one was the diary entry that inspired the painting. And this show traveled around to, I think, 12 museums for a period of 3 or 4 years. This was another entry where my grandmother said, "Today I did the laundry and cleaned the room. This is such a boring life." The rooms were 22 by 22 feet, which is about the size of a two-car garage, and 7 people were expected to live in that space. Only one electrical outlet, no bathroom, no running water. You had to go to a public bathroom and shower facilities, and there were no walls in between. Everything was exposed, and you know, older people in particular had a real hard time with that, obviously. And then this is my last series on the camp experience called Minidoka on My Mind. And I think, well, the painting that is in the collection here in the other room is part of this series. I believe the one that's here is called An American Infamy, and that was the first of 5 versions. Well, actually, I think there are 6 or 7 now. But it was an overview of the camps from the guard towers. And there were, you know, not only barbed wire fence, but guard towers with machine guns. And the machine guns, contrary to what the government said, were pointed in at the internees, not the people outside. The government said that these camps were set up for the protection of the Japanese American people, but why were the machine guns pointed in, not out? It's a large painting. It's about 6 by 9 feet or something. I'm just going to show you a few examples from other paintings that were in that series. This is called Night Watch. That's me buzzing around on the tricycle. So there are 2 other themes. I say themes because this format of using a person standing on the left with the camp on the right, I did about 6 of those, 6 variations. Altogether, I think there are 70 paintings in this series. I think, I say 70, there are only about 30 left. And it's up at the Johnson Museum at Cornell right now. This is a lithograph produced by Lawrence Lithography Workshop. This is a performance I did of the camp theme. It was actually done with a flamenco dancer who happened to be in Lawrence for a couple of weeks, and asked if I would write a performance for her. And my grandmother, before she passed away, in fact it was the last year of her life, wrote a long letter to her relatives in Japan, writing down everything that she had experienced in her life in America, her achievements, the fact she was a midwife, I forgot to say, and she delivered 1,000 babies in Seattle. And I was the last baby that she delivered. She came out of retirement to deliver me her first grandson. So she wrote about all these things to her relatives in Japan, and then she had my grandfather do the same thing. And then they both recorded it. And they recorded it on tape recorders that were, you know, a new invention at that time. And I have those tapes. And actually, there was a period of time that they were in shreds, because after my grandmother passed away, my grandfather would listen to her tape because he missed her so much. And he was living with us at that point, and every night you could hear her talking, reading her letter, and my grandfather would be in his room probably crying. And then one night, it just overcame him, and he shredded the tape. And he pulled the tape out of the recorder, and my dad knew something was wrong, and he ran in the room and he confiscated everything, and tediously, it took him a year, put that tape back together again with Scotch tape, and then made a recording of it for posterity. And I've used that recording in several of my performances. In fact, I did one of the performances here at the theater and during intermission played that tape of her actual voice. So in the background, there's a woman writing that letter, ostensibly my grandmother, writing that letter to Japan, and the dancer is dancing to flamenco music in front of it, and the music is actually not entirely authentically flamenco or Spanish, but very Asian sounding as well. And then a Kurogo pushes that replica of the guard tower past as Grandma's voice starts referring to the camp experience. It's another performance called Amnesia, and this is Carrie Paladin, as some of you may know. She's was a her mother, Marcia Paladin, was my choreographer, and I knew Carrie from the time that she was maybe 5 years old and was in some of my performances at that time, and was just so excited to she was a very theatrical person. And then as she started growing up, I started paying her to be in the performances, and then by the time that she was in her early 20s, it was starting to get a little pricey because it was clear that she was a real talent. And then years went by, she left Lawrence, and I wrote this performance and knew I needed a singer, and I knew that Carrie was an opera singer. And I called her up, and she was in Washington, D.C., and I told her about this performance, and I said, would you be interested in singing the aria to Madame Butterfly? And she said, I'd love to. And I won't quote dollar figures, but when I asked her how much she charged, it turns out that she was working for the New York Opera Company, first of all. And then second of all, of course, in the union. And her budget, her fee was 4 times my entire budget. And, but I hired her anyway. And then she said, I don't fly. And so she said, I'll have to take a train from Washington, D.C. to Seattle, where the performance was at. And, it takes 7 days, and you have to eat 3 times a day, and it's 2 ways, right? Anyway, so she came, but she was the glue that held the whole performance together. Phenomenal singer. This was another act, Keiko Kira, who was in most of my performances. And then on the right, I wanted a Caucasian person that would wear a kimono and play on the koto, which is a Japanese instrument, play Don't Fence Me In. And I found that person. And those suitcases that are piled up there, I drove all the way from Lawrence to Seattle. And by the time we were through editing the performance, the suitcases were in it for only 25 seconds. And this is a painting that sort of summarized that the whole camp experience for me. This is called Nikkei Story, Nikkei meaning Japanese Americans, and the painting is 8 by 12 feet. And the left panel is dedicated to the Issei, the immigrants. The middle panel is my parents, and the right panel is my generation. And there are things that, that's the aluminum pot my grandmother cooked rice in, and in the middle, my mother purchased one of the early electric rice cookers. And then on the right, the top, they start looking like space machines, but it's being supplanted by, Weber barbecue grill and so on. But there are stereotypes in each of them and other references to each generation. I won't go into that at this point. This is the second area I want to talk a little bit about, stereotypes. And during the early 90s, I opened up the Kansas City Star, and this was in the middle of the US auto crisis, when everyone was fearing the Japanese imports, especially in the upper Middle West. And there was an incident that happened in Asia, Asian America, that is one of the landmark incidents. And there was a fellow named Vincent Chin who was Chinese American, okay? Chinese American. Was getting married, and he had his bachelor party at some nightclub that he went to, some public club. And he got there and happened to sit next to a table where there were two white U.S. auto workers who had just lost their jobs, and started harassing Vincent Chin and said, "It's because of you that I lost my job." And Vincent said, "What are you talking about, you know?" And he said, "You and your damn building your foreign cars here, you know, you're so on and so forth." And things started getting very heated. And Vincent said, "Well, you know, first of all, I'm an American. Second of all, I'm not Japanese, you know." But Vincent left. He knew that, you know, there was trouble in the air. And the two auto workers went out after him and chased him down. And they pulled out, in the meantime, a baseball bat out of their car and bludgeoned him to death on the night of his bachelor party. He's getting married the next day. And the police came, arrested the two auto workers, never put them in jail, but took their story, and they were brought to trial. And at the trial, they were each fined $3,000 and were put on probation, even though they admitted to killing Vincent. And so the Asian American community sort of, you know, very upset by the decision and demanded that these two men be retried. In the meantime, one left the country, and they think he died or something, but the other one remained in Detroit and was retried eventually. It took about 2 or 3 years. They retried him, and they increased the fine and continued with his probation, and he was never spent a day in jail for killing Vincent. So that tells you something about what an Asian life was, you know, worth in the upper Midwest during the auto crisis. And I remember opening up the Kansas City Star and finding a picture of a Zero fighter plane that was flying over Kansas City, and piloting the airplane was this buck-toothed, slanted-eyed, yellow-skinned Jap bombing Kansas City with Toyotas and Hondas and, you know, all the foreign imports. And this is just sort of a variation of that theme. This came out of a Los Angeles newspaper. So about that time, I started collecting stereotypes. And this was my collection of Halloween masks that were stereotypes of Japanese, Chinese people. And a lot of them are quite old, although some of them you could still purchase today. I found a couple of them in New Orleans. This was my collection of salt and pepper shakers, Chinese and Japanese people. And these are some postcards from the World War II era. And there were so many that they had variations on a theme like this. There are actually 8 variations of this theme. On the left are what are called patriotics or cachets, and they were, you know, pre-printed envelopes you could buy with stereotypes on them. Or on the right, Jap hunting licenses, and these were given away in dime stores and you know, barbershops and all that, and actually kids used to pick these up, and on the cards it gave you permission to shoot any Jap that you happen to see, you know, walking around the streets. And this is a painting I did trying to express what it felt like to be mistaken for a World War II Jap. And I donated my collection of about 2,000 items to the Wing Luke Asian Museum in Seattle that now has it in their archives that people are using for research. But they gave me an exhibition of not only some of the collection, about 10% of the collection, but also of the paintings that I did that were inspired by the collections. This was sort of the highlight painting of that series. These are all actual stereotypes that were used during World War II. And that's me in the middle, sort of mocking, you know, making my eyes slanted and my teeth bucked. And this is my wife and me. And you know, people always say Asian people all look alike. You know, here are 20 people that I've been mistaken for. And included in there are 2 white guys and 1 Chinese woman. And the woman is second down on the right, and that's Hung Lu. And when Hung Lu had her show at the Kemper, we're very good friends and have been for a long time. You know, I went there to her opening, and I got to the front door, and apparently I got there before Hung Lu, and these 2 women grabbed my arms as I walked through the door, and they said, "You must be Hung Lu." You know. So I've been mistaken for my own father, my cousins, you know, friends. I've been mistaken, and I have no idea why, but the chairman of our department, Peter Thompson, you know. Another stereotype from the last Sansei story, which is the performance that we did here in Johnson County back in the 90s, 91, I guess. And I did a series of paintings called Stereotypes and Admonitions that were 35 stories of racism that I had experienced myself since being in Kansas. And this one happened during the Iran hostage crisis. And I'm sure all of you remember that. And I was out jogging at the time down this county road, and I saw this truck coming towards me. That was not unusual until it started slowing down and changing lanes and coming on my side, and I knew that there was impending problems coming up. And just at that moment that person, I stopped and the truck stopped, and there was one guy sitting in there, and he rolled down the window and he shoved his finger out and pointed it right in my face, and he said, "That's for your Ayatollah, you Chinaman." And then okay, this is the last series I'll talk about, and I'll go through this pretty quickly. An American knockoff refers back to a lot of issues that Asian Americans had and have had for many, many years. And one of them is this idea of being foreigners. You know, I mean, to this day, I'm still presumed to be a foreigner, you know, in my own country. And I don't know what it is about Asian people, but they're usually, I always use the term forever foreign. And I decided to do a series of portraits, and this is one that actually popped up many, many years ahead of its time. It was during the US auto crisis when I sort of sarcastically thought, well, you know, everyone's afraid Japan's going to take over this country, because that whole debate came up when the auto crisis started, and the Japanese were trying to buy Rockefeller Center, which really upset a lot of Americans. And so I decided that I would Japanize everybody. And I started with 15 of my friends that live in Lawrence, and I started with myself. But I would also tell something about that person in the paintings. And I was teaching at Carleton College in 1990 for a semester, teaching performance art. And I also had developed heart issues. And so I was taking my blood pressure almost every hour. And the video camera refers to teaching performance art and also writing the script to my next major performance piece that's in the blue cover notebook. So that was the first time that I painted myself. And then later on, I had a show here in Kansas City at the Jan Weiner Gallery, and I did this show called Wannabes, Gotta Bees, and Gonna Bees. You know, and I again used myself just to try to express how strange some of these juxtapositions actually are. I think it's nothing needs to be said about these. And this is the painting that was called Forever Foreign. And that's me in the middle, blending in with all these Japanese people, even though culturally I'm something very, very different than all those people, but presumed by the public to be the same. You know, I once, and don't any of you do this now, but I once gave a talk to an audience like this, and after it was finished, a woman came up to me afterwards, up to the podium, and said, "But you never said what part of Japan you were from." She sat there and listened to everything you have, you know, listened to at this point. So I've done about 30 paintings. People say that one of me is Sailor Moon is the scariest one. You know, one of the things that used to annoy us the most was being mistaken for being Chinese. And Chinese people I knew felt the same way. They didn't want to be mistaken for being Japanese. And so here I am. This is called Chinese Imposter. And so I'm sort of blending in. And this is Chinese Imposter number 5. These are all 5 by 5 feet. That's a tattoo I have of that says Minidoka. That's sort of my proof that I'm not Chinese. Now this is me, again, separating myself from Japanese nationals. This is beating up Disney for all the stereotypes that they've created. And I think these are the stereotypes. Every one of these figures that surround me are stereotypes that Walt Disney has created. And of course, I stereotype myself as being the martial artist, you know, because if you're Asian, you must know martial arts, right? And then separating myself from stereotypes. This painting was purchased by the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian. 6 by 12 feet, I believe. Okay, 2 more slides. This is just a public art piece I did many years ago. That's in, if you're ever in Seattle, the underground bus system, downtown platform is where this is located. It's 36 feet long. It's done on steel panels, so it's graffiti proof. You can actually hit it with a hammer. And it's been there for all these years, since 1988, and it looks like the day it was installed. It's just in pristine condition. And this is the only sculpture I've done, and it's a totem of objects that all have something to do with immigration and that old question about whether when you come to this country you should be a tossed salad or a melting pot. You know, those are two entire different philosophies, and it's meant to address that. I don't have the time to break this down for you, but there are haikus that are written by an African American, a Hispanic American, Caucasian, and an Asian on the four sides of that pedestal. And every year they have a contest among the public school kids in this neighborhood to look at this piece and to write a haiku that expresses their feelings about what the piece is about. And then the one is chosen, and it's printed on a bronze plaque and displayed on that wall behind the piece. So it continues to live every year. Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah, here over here.
I will ask you your explications were very helpful in understanding what your intent was and the impact of your work. Do you find students and the public in general can respond to your work without an explanation?
You mean non-Asian students? You know, actually I say that, and probably Asian American students can stand some explanation as well. But I think, you'd have to answer that question yourself. I mean, how much of this stuff were you aware of, before you came and heard this talk? I would imagine there's something about organizing this in the presentation that helps. There's probably not that much new information. I mean, is there anybody here that didn't know that the Japanese Americans were in camps during World War II? Is there anybody here that didn't know that? See, this is a big difference. 30 or 40 years ago, when I asked that question, maybe a third. And it depends on where you're at in the country. Like on the East Coast, they are much more prone not to know about it. It's really all up and down the West Coast, where the people that were affected the most live, that they know the most about. But my high school American history book still has a very, very, I think it's less than a paragraph. It's a short paragraph about the Japanese Americans being put in camp. But if you go to the Deep South, like, I've lectured in Jackson, Mississippi, and, the people there are just sort of saying, what the hell are you talking about? Not in this country. And it's just like, water off a duck's back. They didn't want to ask anything more about it. They just thought that was so ridiculous that I was making it up as, using it as an excuse to make art. So, whereas if I go to Los Angeles and lecture, it's a completely different kind of response there. I mean, the people there are so excited that someone's talking about this and making images about it and lecturing about it and all that. So you can't underestimate, the region. That question would have different answers depending on where you asked it.
I thought I saw you. Yeah.
What's your opinion on labels like Mongoloid or Asiatic?
Well, Mongoloid, I don't know if my birth certificate under race, they used to write Mongolian. I mean, that preceded Oriental, and these are very derogatory terms, but considering the times, the majority culture was sort of calling all the shots and saying, this is what you are, whether you like it or not. We're calling you Mongolians, And I always remember babies that were born that were called Mongoloids, you know. And so there was that association that if you were Mongolian, you were sort of Mongoloid, you know. If you were Oriental, you were like a rug, you know. I mean, these are all terms. That's why, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, Asian people stood up for themselves and says, no, you know, we want to be known as being Asian, you know, not Oriental. Those are your terms. Somebody over here.
How and when did you develop your interest in art?
I had three uncles that my mom's three brothers that were all very, very successful graphic designers in Seattle. I mean, they were way up there at the top. And they never, you know, helped me make, you know, any decisions about my profession. In fact, they sort of stood back and just sort of let it happen. It was my father that insisted that I fulfill he was a pharmacist. And he was in college right before the Depression. And when the Depression hit, he had to get out of college as quickly as he could, which was, because he was in pre-med, which was to become a pharmacist. So he always felt like, you know, there was unfulfilled dreams and that his son would fulfill, you know, his dreams someday. And I mean, he should have seen it coming because I had no interest in medicine, you know. And I used to love to draw. I used to draw everything that I couldn't own. You know, there were Schwinn bikes, there were cowboy boots that my mom said they'll ruin your feet because they're so pointed, you know. But what it was, we couldn't afford it. And so I used to draw cowboy boots. It was like magic. Everything I couldn't have, I drew. And you know, my mom and dad knew that. My dad knew that, you know, that's what was first in my mind. And so the day before the first enrollment, he came in, first enrollment to the University of Washington, he came in and said, well, have you thought about going into pre-med, you know? And I said, no. You know, as I'm going into art, and he said, you know, your three uncles are artists. They never went to university. They all went to two-year art schools, and it'd be a waste to go to a four-year university to become like them. He tried that approach. And I said, I don't care. That's what I'm going to do. And he says, let's compromise. And I thought, how do you compromise between being a doctor and an artist? So he says, I'll give you a day to think about it. He came back the next day, and he said, have you given some thought to it? And I said, a little. And I thought to myself, you know, maybe architecture, you know, because there was something about architecture that always intrigued me. And I thought, you know, that's maybe a little bit more professional. You know, it's not medicine, but, you know. And so I said to my dad, what about architecture? And he says, no. What about dentistry? So at that point, I'm sorry, this is taking a long time to answer the question, but, you know, we were just so far apart, and at that point, you know, I did it my way, and you know, I think it worked out for the better. It worked out the only way it could work out, actually.
You know, we are over time here, but let's at least get one more question, okay?
I have a copy of your print titled Buddha Head. Could you
Buddha
explain
Head.
to us what Buddha Head means?
It's Buddha head.
Buddha.
Yeah. And that's one of those terms that Japanese Americans sort of privilege themselves calling each other. And it was especially used a lot during World War II among the Japanese Americans in the 442nd Infantry Regiment. And because a lot of the Japanese Americans were Buddhists, and they would call them Buddha heads, you know. And but you know, anybody outside of that group of people really weren't entitled to use that term. You know, it was sort of like going where you shouldn't be going, you know, but it was all right if you were in that group to call each other that. Does that answer your question? Yep.
Well, folks, we should wrap things up here, I guess. Roger, I can't thank you enough for, you know, having come and shared all of this with us.
Thank you.
It's good.